If you lived in Maryland in the 90s and you enjoyed a roadside burger around that time, you might find yourself desperately trying to remember what exactly the owner of that burger stand looked like, and if that particular burger seller looked anything like Joe Metheny, then you'd have every right to be seriously worried. Why? Because Joseph Roy Metheny was a serial killer who served his victims in burgers. Joseph Roy Metheny was born on the 2nd of March 1955 in Baltimore, Maryland. His childhood story depends entirely on who is telling it. It is a mystery. For Joe Metheny, his childhood was horrible. According to him, both he and his 5 siblings were neglected as his mother worked double shifts outside the home. According to him, his alcoholic father had died in a car accident in 1961 and he suffered depression. He said that his parents often sent him to live with other families in foster-like arrangements. He also says that his mother passed away at a later date. This was false. These comments must have come as a bit of a shock to Mrs. Metheny, who, after Joe's arrest, was still very much alive. She said that whilst she did have to work multiple odd jobs to make ends meet, there was nothing unusual or particularly hard about his childhood compared to others. She had worked as a waitress, barmaid and food truck driver to provide for her family, and that they were somewhat poor, but they had never gone hungry or been put into homes with other families like he claimed. They had a normal family life. She said that he was smart and had a good childhood. If he was neglected, it was his own fault. It was a pretty good home. She did confirm that his father was indeed a heavy drinker and he had passed on after a car accident. She disputed Joe's other comments about his hardship and upbringing. His teachers and his mother both recall that Joe Metheny was a very polite young man and he did well in his classes, showing a spark of intellect. He was not mean as a child. This politeness and intelligence would follow him throughout his life, although it would become warped and jaded over time. Metheny joined the United States Army in 1973 at the age of 19. His mother said that he served in Germany. But according to Metheny, he was stationed in Vietnam. He claimed to have been addicted to heroin while on a tour in Vietnam. It should also be noted that the U.S. Army had no active involvement in Vietnam by the time. No records exist of him being stationed in Southeast Asia or seeing any action there. According to Metheny's mother, drugs are the worst things that ever happened to Metheny. Despite being a forklift driver, Metheny spent all his money on crack cocaine, heroin and liquor. This, however, did not affect his job and he was described as intelligent, well-spoken and very well-mannered. He was fondly known as Tiny, despite being 6'1", large-framed and overweight. By night he would retreat to his trailer that was parked on the grounds of his workplace, or he would head out and spend his night with a group of homeless or drug-addicted men in makeshift camps in South Baltimore. Now exactly when Joe Metheny started killing, it is not quite clear. But what triggered the murders was the absence of his wife and son one evening when he went home. His wife had taken his 6-year-old son. His wife leaving did not bother him, but the fact that she took their son enraged him. She had also taken anything of value and vanished. He says that 6 months later, she was arrested with drugs along with the man she had eloped with. Their child was taken by the state and put in foster care. They were later released and Metheny took it upon himself to find these two. Metheny said, "It all started back in July of 1994. I was at work, I was a truck driver. I was working overtime this one night. Then I got off and went home as I always did. But when I opened the door and turned on the light, I noticed there was nothing there. My old lady had taken everything including my son and left me. Her leaving was not my problem. But she took my 6-year-old son with her. She was a crack addict and a worthless piece of shit. I would have paid her to get out of my life. All she had to do was take my son over to my mother's house and she could have had everything else and be gone. I found out about 6 months later she had moved on the other side of town with some asshole that had her out selling her ass for drugs. They got busted for drugs and they took my son away from them for child neglect and child abuse. I had no chance of going to social services and trying to get my son back due to my past criminal record. So I took it upon myself, with the hatred I had for these two who lost my son, to go looking for them. I had found out from someone that they was going under that bridge and getting high with some homeless motherfuckers who lived under that bridge. He found out that they had been seen under the Baltimore's Hanover Street Bridge. He didn't find his wife but found two homeless men, Randall Brewer and Randy Piker, who told him they didn't know where his wife was. In a fit of rage, he bludgeoned them with an axe. He then went ahead and killed two other women who didn't have any information. As he was trying to dispose of the bodies, he saw a fisherman who he thought had seen him, so he killed him too. The police doubt the 3 other murders that Metheny claims, as no bodies were found. That was a very busy night for me, 5 murders within about 7 hours. I washed up in that river and cleaned up the crime scene as much as I could, then left. 2.5 weeks later I was arrested and charged with the murders of the 2 men I chopped up. He however left the axe and it was used to commit another crime by another person. He was arrested and put on trial for killing 2 homeless men with an axe. After 18 months in Baltimore City Jail, he was released due to lack of evidence. Metheny's first confirmed murder came in 1994, a woman named Kathy Ann Magaziner. She was a 39-year-old sex worker that he'd met and taken back to his trailer. After sexually assaulting her, he took an extension cord and wrapped it around her neck, then slowly strangled her to death. Immediately after the murder, he buried her remains in a shallow grave at the pallet factory where he worked. Her body was not found for 2 years. Later, after 6 months, he must have had a change of mind because he dug up her body and hacked off her head, put it in a box, before throwing it into the trash. He reburied what was left of her body in a nearby woods. The second confirmed murder was a woman named Kimberly Lynn Spicer. She was stabbed to death in November of 1996. This was barely a month before Metheny was arrested. Once again she had been lured to Joe's trailer park home before he sexually assaulted her and then stabbed her. He then went ahead and buried her body in the woods. Now, according to him, this is when he decided to begin a meat stand business. He stored chopped up pieces of meat from his victims in Tupperware containers, which he then put in the freezer. He would offer passers-by and the occasional trucker burgers. According to him, his customers were impressed by his burgers and were selling very well. According to him, this is when he went out to look for more. That is when he met Rita Kemper. I lured 2 more crack whores up there to my trailer. I killed and butchered their bodies up. I cut the meat up and put it in some Tupperware bowls, then put it in a freezer. I buried the remains in several shallow graves in a little woods behind the company. Over the next couple weeks on the weekends I opened up a little open-pit beef stand. I had real roast beef and pork sandwiches, and why not, they were very good. The human body tastes was very similar to pork. If you mix it together no one can tell the difference. Now there are 2 stories of how Metheny was found and arrested. One of them included him trying to murder another young woman. In December of 1996, Metheny brought Rita Kemper back to his trailer. They shared some drugs together, and then when she rebuffed his sexual advances, he attacked her. He then threatened to bury her in the woods with the other girl. According to Metheny, Rita Kemper climbed wooden pallets that had been stacked against an 8-foot chain-link fence and jumped over. A guy in a pickup truck picked her up and took her to a gas station where she called the police. Metheny says from the moment Kemper escaped he knew the police were coming for him, and he therefore gathered Kemper's items and walked to the gates where he had earlier locked to prevent Kemper from escaping. Just then a police car pulled up and pointed a gun at Metheny. Everything was going pretty good until I ran out of my special meat. So I lured another bitch up to my trailer. I got her in there and started to rip her clothes off and knocking the hell out of her. She was screaming, but there was no one around to hear her except me. And I just kept on laughing at her. I turned around for a split second, and that was my mistake, for she ran out the door before I could get to her. There was an 8-foot chain link fence with barbed wire on top of it around the front of the company. There was a stack of wooden pallets next to the fence about 10 feet high. That bitch scaled those pallets like a monkey and jumped the fence, and ran down to the main road where some guy in a pickup truck picked her up and took her to a nearby gas station where they called the cops. Well, I knew the cops were on the way, but I didn't run. I gathered up her clothing, grabbed the keys to the gate, and went out and opened it. Soon as I step out the gate, a cop car pulled up. And the cop jumped out and pulled his gun on me and told me to get on the ground. And that is where it all came to an end. Now the second story of Metheny's arrest is more bizarre. According to Joe Stein Jr., who was the son of Joseph Stein Sr., the owner of the pallet company where Joe Metheny worked, Metheny was more than just the forklift driver he claimed. He was a member of a criminal enterprise that was engaged in grand theft, arson and even murder. The owner of the pallet company was known as Joseph Edward Stein Sr., popularly known as Jack. He was a criminal who had spent a lot of his time in jail for his crimes. According to his son, Joe Stein Jr., his parents were his parents only by a biological sense. His mother was a ferocious alcoholic who destroyed her liver and passed away at age 33, leaving him orphaned when he was age 15. Joe Jr. lived with his relatives after his father, Jack, was sentenced to 20 years in prison when he was aged 3 for breaking into a pharmacy and stealing drugs. No one cared about him and he never went to school. Jack was released when Joe turned 13. Jack moved in with Joe's aunt and uncle and eventually ended up marrying Patricia Ashbrick, who was Joe Jr.'s aunt's younger sister. They ended up getting 3 children. Jack had not changed his ways and soon recruited Joe Jr. to do his biddings as a burglar. Joe was slim and therefore he could slip through small window openings. He taught Joe how to climb drain pipes, how to disengage an alarm, how to crack safes. The targets were to be pharmacies because Jack was mainly interested in getting his hands on drugs to sell: amphetamines, barbiturates, morphine, even cocaine. But he also instructed Joe to be on the lookout for anything of value: guns, money order forms, postage stamps, cigarettes, jewelry, anything he could sell on the street. After the initial fright and worry about being caught, Joe soon started developing something of a professional pride. In 1970, Jack was caught again and sentenced to 6 years in prison. Joe continued with his robberies in the absence of his father. He was later arrested for some robberies and was sentenced to 12 years in December 1971. He was released after 5 years and rejoined his father, and they continued with burglaries. Towards the end of 1982, Joe met Donna Ashbrick, who was Patricia's 17-year-old niece. They fell in love and had a daughter within the first year of marriage. A son would follow 3 years later in 1986. In 1985, his father was sentenced to 10 years in prison for stealing goods from a building contractor in Carroll County. This was when Joe Jr. was awakened from his life of crime and the thought of doing it anymore disgusted him. He changed and stopped living a life of crime. He joined the Pentecostal church and quit drugs. He also stopped seeing his father Jack. He looked for jobs as a welder, and his wife was working as a nurse's assistant in a weight control clinic. They were eventually able to buy a home and they moved. Jack claimed to have been saved too and was now a business owner of Joe Stein & Son, a pallet company. It was located on Hollands Ferry Road. He said he would acquire wooden pallets and repair them for sale. When they met at a family funeral, Jack offered Joe Jr. a place at his company as he had heard that Joe had trouble making ends meet. Joe thought of this as a blessing and was happy. His happiness was, however, short-lived. Joe discovered that all was not pure at Stein & Son. Neither Joe nor Donna, who often visited the business, could avoid the implications of what they saw out of the corners of their eyes and conversations they overheard. Envelopes of cash changed hands. Merchandise having nothing to do with pallets, television sets, refrigerators, paper products, food, arrived at the loading dock and then disappeared. Jack was stealing again. He either stole merchandise from the companies or shortchanged his clients in pallets. This was a massive criminal operation. Joe was conflicted on what to do. He decided to report his father, and in 1995, he secretly met with Jim Fitzsimmons, who was an FBI special agent, and told him everything he knew. And so, he became a spy for the FBI within the organization, many at times wearing a wire to secret investigations. This went on for a year until Clinton Ashbrook, who was the brother to Donna, who also worked at the pallet company, revealed something more appalling. The night before, Clinton had been drinking beer and doing lines of cocaine with Metheny. According to both Joe and Clinton Ashbrook, Metheny was also Jack's enforcer, a huge, soulless man with tattoos of teardrops and a cross on his face and an appetite for violence. Metheny confided to Ashbrook that he had stabbed a young woman to death in his trailer. Her body was still outside on Stein Company property, and he wanted help getting rid of it. He then led Ashbrook to her body, amid the trash behind the main building. While they stood there, Metheny nudged his foot against the body a few times and cursed his victim. Aghast, Ashbrook mumbled an excuse and took off on his motorcycle. After Clinton told this story to Joe, he arranged for a meeting with his FBI contacts. This presented an inconvenience to their current investigation, as they were still collecting evidence against Jack. Metheny's murders had got nothing to do with the central elements of the Stein investigations. Ashbrook agreed to get evidence against Metheny. Ashbrook wore a wire and they got Metheny's confession on tape. With clear evidence of violence, authorities had to move, even if they hadn't collected all they needed to prosecute the grand theft case. As Metheny and Jack emerged from a company Christmas party at Martin's East, authorities arrested them. They charged Metheny with the killing of 3 women: Kimberly Spicer, 26, whose body was found under a box trailer in southwest Baltimore; Tony Lynn Ingracia, 28, whose body was found nearly 3 years prior dumped along Interstate 95 near Caton Avenue; and an unidentified woman whose headless remains were dug up 40 feet from the trailer. Jack was charged with being an accessory after the fact for allegedly helping Metheny clean the trailer and get rid of clothing and other evidence of Spicer's murder. After Metheny's arrest, he led police to a shallow grave on the Stein property containing the decapitated remains of another woman he had killed. "They had me sitting in a little room down at Homicide, drilling me and damn near kissing my ass, trying to find out what I had done. They pulled me out of city jail every day for 1 month, taking me back and forth between the company and the bridge. I had they going crazy over at the company digging up the remains of those 2 bitches there. 'Cause I had their remains buried in 7 different holes. The only thing I feel bad about in any of this is I didn't get to murder the 2 motherfuckers I was really after. And that's my ex-old lady and the bastard she got hooked up with." In August 1998, he pleaded guilty to murdering and robbing Magaziner, and prosecutors sought the death penalty in that case, as well. His lawyer claimed that he had killed while under the influence of drugs. He received a sentence of life in prison in that case. His death sentence was overturned in 2000, and the sentence for the murder of Spicer was reduced to life without parole. At his sentencing hearing, he said that he committed murders because he enjoyed it, he got a rush out of it, got a high out of it, and had no real excuse why other than I like to do it. The rationale for the death penalty was that the murder had been committed in committing a robbery, but the evidence indicated that robbery was not his motivation. Metheny was found dead in his prison cell at the Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, on August 5, 2017, at the age of 62. There are people who Joe might have killed and we have the bodies, but we just